Thanks, Jim. I want to start off by thanking the Dene, Athabascan people on whose ancestral lands we are speaking today. And I'd also like to thank Jim and Ben Potter and Larry Kaplan and others of the organizing committee for putting this session together. It's an honor to participate in this Dene-Yenisian conference. I've attended previous conferences but haven't participated up until this point in time because I wasn't sure what I would really contribute to the discussion. I think that Ben's done a very excellent job of making a series of connections between the archaeological record and Dene people on this side, Yeniseian people over on the Russian, Siberian side. But the more I thought about what I might potentially contribute to the discussion, and I would have come anyway just to listen to this excellent series of papers, but the more thinking about it in terms of what I might contribute to the discussion, having already given a couple of papers on similar subjects to the one or the ones that Ben's given in symposia in Edmonton and also recently in Paris, as Claire knows, about tracing Athabascan ancestry and some of the pitfalls in terms of trying to link it to stone tool industries and so on, that I would kind of take a different tack today. Although I do have to say about getting into it that I was really really refreshing for me to see some of the things that Ben was talking about here in his last paper in terms of not just drawing continuities with stone tool assemblages or other physical remains per se, but really focusing on behavioral continuities, because that's the kind of thing that I've been arguing for a long time in our work, my work with northeastern at the Littlejohn site across the border into the Yukon, is that it's really the continuities with contemporary peoples in terms of various elements of flexibility, of low-density peoples in boreal forest environments, including the great importance of sharing, of food sharing, which was one of the elements I was pleased to see on here, and one that I've emphasized a lot in terms of the kind of elements of flexibility you really need to survive under those sets of circumstances. And also aspects of flexibility in terms of social organization and even hunting, where women are very much involved with a lot of the hunting, moose hunting, and in fact in potlatches that I've been to in that area provided sometimes all of the moose meat for potlatches there. It's just all of these elements of flexibility in terms of social rules and various aspects of behavior that are part and parcel of the survivability, long-term survivability in these low population densities, in these kind of, as Ben said, often precarious boreal forest environments that, to me, ties together ancient and modern people, perhaps more than the details, because in terms of Athabascan identity, at least in terms of Dena'ina people that I've worked with in Anchorage area, identity is less connected to stone tools, or even whether one hunts bison as opposed to caribou or moose, than it is to many aspects of social organization and of things like sharing behavior, which really are the elements of continuity in culture that in many ways are apart from and very difficult to distinguish in different elements of the archaeological record. So just a comment on, I think, the extreme usefulness of some of those arguments that Ben was putting forward. So I don't want to duplicate those kinds of things. So what I've decided to do is to focus a little bit less on that than on talking about as Ed mentioned, that this wedge of cultures that came in and really separated the former continuum of Dene-Yeniseian cultures, and as we were talking about at the break also, Yukaghir culture is representing the remnants of boreal forest peoples left behind from what was once perhaps the most long-distance continuum of linguistically of any group in the history of humankind that we know about. So I'm less interested here in the dispersion and the distribution originally of Dene-Yeniseian peoples and the interruption of those connections that became established over time, the timing of this wedge, and how it links particularly with paleo-environmental change during the Holocene period, especially the expansion of steppe in relation to climate change. And because, as Ed noted, the Yeniseian has been under pressure for some thousands of years, and certainly it's that degree of antiquity that we're looking at, not just in terms of the distribution of Dene-Yenisieian peoples, but also in terms of the things that disrupted them by serving as a kind of a wedge coming basically from the south, something that we really don't have to talk about so much in this part of the world, although I think that in many ways North American archaeologists, including Alaskan archaeologists, have sort of had a pretense of pristine cultures without influence from external groups in a way in which perhaps people in the old world haven't had. But in making these arguments, I think what I want to do is to sort of take a push-pull kind of aspect of looking at this in terms of these groups expanding into the Dene-Yeniseian homeland as a function both of opportunistic expansion into newly available lands being made available through climate change, but also demographic pressure. And I'm not so sure that those can really be separated, because as groups built up in the steppe environment and expanded, looking for areas to expand northward, they took opportunistic, I think, reasons for moving into some of those newly available areas. So it's really a kind of a combination of a push-pull argument. And then the other final thing that I wanted to mention before getting into this is that I'm basically talking about ideas about this sort of whole-scale movement or migration of cultures with a variety of different cultural elements that were distinctive from those of the groups into whose homelands they were moving. But also at the same time, I recognize the fact that you have the diffusion of individual cultural elements that's occurring simultaneously, or even as a first wave beyond these sorts of things. And I was particularly, again, glad to see one of the things that Ed mentioned in his talk, which was this this business of the linkage of shamanism with metalworking in particular, and also, Ben mentioned these different words for iron, because I've become really convinced in terms of a lot of things that I've seen, mostly common in working with Yukaghir people in the area of Primoria, where I've done 3 field seasons of archaeological work, that there is this real connection between the diffusion of things related to metalworking and shamanism per se, in the sense that shamans had specialist metalworkers working with them, and it was through that avenue, essentially a ritual religious rather than a subsistence-based avenue, that a lot of these diffusion of ideas and even words took place. Although I'm focusing on subsistence and demographic related things, I do recognize that there's other contexts of culture, ritual, or religious aspects for the diffusion of a lot of ideas and so on as a part of that process. So here's what we're looking at. Here is the distribution of peoples in northern Asia around 1600 AD in the 17th century. I guess the moment of, I guess we could say, contact, in terms of contact with Russian peoples moving eastward, languages of northern Eurasia in the early 17th century, in which you see Yeniseian restricted to that area of the Yenisei River Valley, with other peoples having moved into other areas, including the Turkic peoples, Yakut or Sakha people, much further to the east in the Aldan area, and Yukaghir restricted to an area of northeast Asia, of northeastern Siberia, and so on. But what I want to do is to talk about this within the context of the steppes further south and the peoples that developed there, and the timing of migrations northward from there into the areas of these boreal forest peoples and paleo-environmental correlates. So here is steppe lands of Inner Asia today, showing the extent of the sort of east-west belt from the Black Sea steppe over to the Kazakh steppe, where horse domestication first seems to have taken place, and eastward towards the Mongolian steppe. And here's a distribution, a map, old one, but still useful, I think, for livestock distributions, showing the distributions of reindeer, cattle, sheep, pigs, and even camels. So you have to talk about that pattern of pastoralism, domestication, which developed in the area. So reindeer domestication certainly to the north in the area of the Yukaghir region today, but further to the south, we certainly have other kinds of domesticated animals, including sheep and pigs, and also horse in those areas that we have to talk about. So just a review here of the basic framework of the chronology of early steppe pastoralism in the region. About 4000 BC, 6,000 years ago, the Copper Age in Europe is when it seems that the earliest horse domestication in northern Kazakhstan spreads to the east of the Caspian Sea and then west to the eastern Ukraine, Dnieper River region. And then within 500 years after that, by 3500 BC, the beginning of kurgans with the horse burials associated with greater reliance on horses, greater mobility, and more widespread settlement. By 3000 BC, within 500 years after that, the horse domestication expanding into the Yenisei River region, the upper Yenisei region, widespread pastoral nomadism developing. And then between 3000 and 2500 BC, Bactrian camels also domesticated in the Kopadag region of Turkmenistan, for example, the Yukaghir site. So over this period of time of 1500 years, from 4000 BC to 2500 BC, we have a widespread pattern of domestication developing in this area, which then moves on to other regions, as we'll talk about. So now we're actually going to go back a little bit further in time and talking about paleo-environmental, paleoclimatic change. But I just want to set out this framework first in terms of domestication, because we're going to lay that against this paleo-environmental framework, but then we'll move forward and talk about some of the things that took place with, events that took place with climatic change after 2500 BC, and look at how they may have influenced the spread of some of these domestication processes and the groups linked with them that began during this period of time. So this is the kind of synthetic record for the Holocene for this area of southern Siberia, ranging from the northern part of Central Asia and the basic steppes region. That represents, I think, a pretty good picture based on recent pollen evidence that shows the major climatic fluctuations taking place during the Holocene period. And what we have here is a kind of cartoon, if you will, that includes both temperature and precipitation changes taking place over time. So we've got in one index here, in the solid index, we've got the temperature changes taking place over time, the number 1, and we see the patterns of increasing and decreasing temperature relative to the present during the Holocene period here in this region. And on the other side, we've got the changes in precipitation taking place over time, and you can see that there is a strong degree of relationship between these two, but that relationship is really a lot more solid for the early Holocene period, from say 10 to 8,000 years ago, and for the late Holocene period, say to some degree after about 3,000 years ago, than it is for the middle Holocene period, where we see to some degree of correspondence between these, but in terms of the arguments made from the palynological record, quite a bit of divergence too between patterns of aridity or dryness and moisture and patterns of temperature change during this this period. Now, to some degree, that may be a function, particularly for the older time period, on the accuracy of some of the data and even some of the dating taking place within these pollen cores and so on. But I still think that it represents a fairly good statement of these paleoclimatic conditions over time. At least I'm using it for a first statement here about some of these relationships. I do want to emphasize that what I'm talking about here is really just a first statement of ideas on a lot of these subjects, with the intention of fleshing these out a lot more in the future with more specific archaeological data and historic data relating to a lot of these trends. And so for me, this is kind of a first venture into this area. I like to put myself a little bit beyond my comfort zone sometimes in looking at things. So I am going to be going to Mongolia in September to hopefully initiate some research in that area. So again, this is just kind of a first statement along these lines. So in terms of a synthesis of paleoenvironmental episodes in Central and Northeast Asia, basically the period from about 6,000 BC to 5,000 BC, or as representing warmer, drier conditions, the hypsothermal period associated with steppe expansion, also associated with higher sea levels in the Russian Far East and some of the areas I've been working there. Transition from Mesolithic to Neolithic cultures when early ceramics are beginning to appear in the Amur River region, for example. So this is the first of these really noticeable warmer, drier phases associated with steppe expansion. 5,000 to 4,000 BC, relatively cooler, wetter conditions, followed by somewhat warmer but also wetter conditions towards the end of this 1,000-year period. I'm trying to collapse these into somewhat larger units. Associated with little or no steppe expansion. This is the early Neolithic period, in which we have a spread of Middle Eastern farming complex north of the Caspian Sea into this region of western Siberia. So this is a diagram from one of Marek Zvelibil's works in which he's showing the dispersal of farming in Europe and Central Asia, 5,000 to 4,000 BC, in which he's showing the distribution of hunter-gatherers to the north, of farming, which is moving up in a kind of a wave from the Middle Eastern area that moves to the east and around through the Ural Mountains area into the steppe region, kind of similar in a way of similar kind of movements that have been suggested for the Amur River region, coming up from North China and moving around in a kind of, in that case, a kind of a clockwise fashion into the Amur River and then down into Primoria from there. But anyway, so here we see this this distribution and his interpretation of early farming coming from that area coming in. But not so much animal domestication, at least in terms of what we're talking about here in terms of horse domestication, which is coming about after 4,000 BC. And then we also see what he calls this availability zone in between, where an area which was a potential for eventually for farming and domestication, but hadn't yet been achieved by that point in time. So then this is the period 5,000 to 4,000 BC, the spread of Middle Eastern farming complex north of the Caspian Sea region into western Siberia. And then 4,000 to 3,500 BC, significantly greater aridity. Cooling followed by dramatic warming associated with significant steppe expansion at this point in time. This is again a period of significantly higher sea levels in the Russian Far East, the so-called Jomon transgression, a period of time in which in that area, which where I've done a lot of my earlier work, in which there is and I'm more familiar with the environmental change, oak vegetation spreading like Quercus mongolica, Mongolian oak coming up from North China. A late Neolithic period in which the spread of the North Chinese farming complex is coming into this area, and archaeological evidence of invasions over wide areas. So continuing on after this period of time, 3,500 to 3,000 BC, a period of significantly warmer, somewhat wetter conditions, some continued steppe expansion, and continued sea level rise. during that time. Significant expansion of pastoralism into Central and Northeast Asia, with some archaeological evidence for invasions of pastoralist peoples. Then 3000 to 2500 BC, a second wave of temperature increase leading to a thermal maximum, which you can see here between, as it says here, between 5000 and 4500 BP. You can see that in this area a really great increase in aridity during this period of time, although not necessarily a great increase in temperature. And so this seems to be a period of great expansion of pastoral nomadism, greater archaeological evidence for invasions of pastoral peoples. It's the early Bronze Age people with the horse domestication known from the upper Yenisei River Valley during that period of time. Then there's a period of about 500 years of neoglacial conditions, probably the greatest cooling since the Younger Dryas period. You can see that sharp cooling that took place during that period of time. There seems to be little or no steppe expansion, no archaeological evidence for migrations. But then we have from 2000 to 1500 BC dramatically warmer conditions and increased aridity until the end of the period. Renewed and heightened steppe expansion. This is the so-called steppe Bronze Age, with archaeological evidence of invasions over wide areas, probably expansion into vacant lands and territories of both hunters and farmers, and cultural uniformity over the region from Eastern European steppe to Mongolia, resulting in the fusion of elements of pastoral nomadism and forest adaptations in western and southern Siberia, especially in major river valleys, kurgans with yurts, associated rock art depictions of warriors traveling by river and ski pulled by horses. For example, the Okunevo culture, which you can see there in the Miniskinsk area of the upper Yenisei River Valley, which is related to Western Mongolia in terms of some of the burials that are formed there, the physical type of burials. It's also, of course, a period of so-called Caucasian or Caucasoid expansion, with the 100 plus Urumqi burials in Xinjiang province in northwest China, and also evidence of trade with the Assyrian Empire and possible invasions of northern India. And then finally, at 1500 to 1000 BC, continuing aridity, somewhat reduced temperatures, approaching modern conditions. And I think it's in this period that we're seeing population expansions become less related to environmental than technological change and other factors. These are the late Bronze Age cultures, the Karasuk culture in the upper Yenisei River region, the formation of the Scythian coalescence by the end of this period, 1000 BC, linked to the slab grave cultures of Mongolia, and related cultures in Lake Baikal and the Ordos region, in which, as Ben was saying, Altai cultures have now come into replacing those earlier Neolithic cultures in the Lake Baikal area. And so there clearly were, events that were important. Clearly were events that were important, that continued after this point in time, such as the Scythian expansion during 1000 to 500 BC with Iron Age cultures related to the first Chinese descriptions of the Mohe tribes in the upper Amur River region. Then cooler conditions and greater aridity, probably some expansion, some steppe expansion related to records of Turkic Shungnu and Mongolic Tungu in southern Siberia at the beginning of this period in the formation of the Shungnu Empire. The next 500 years of the Roman Warm period, the Shenpi or Mongol advance into southern Siberia, and then in the next 400 years somewhat cooler, wetter conditions with the expansion of the Turkic Shungnu descendants, formation of the Turkic Khaganate, control over the Altai region, the Yenisei Turkic inscriptions, and then the Uyghur Mongolic Empire with the displacement of these, in turn displaced by Turkic Kyrgyz, where remnant Uyghur groups were still controlling the Siberian fur trade. And then the medieval warm period with an expansion of Mongolic groups throughout the region, including southern Siberia, and probably Tungusic groups as well. So, of course, we all know the various different groups that have been placed in this Dene, Caucasian or Altaic group, and that these have, essentially become emplaced where they are as a result of this historical expansion, both of Turkic groups like Yakut and with Tungusic groups. The question is, the timing of this enterprise. So what I think are the best reconstructions linking this paleoenvironmental, archaeological, historic, and linguistic evidence that Dene-Yenisian and Yukaghir are descendants of Siberian Neolithic cultures with relatively little displacement until around 4000 BC. That within the 500 years after that, you had major initial late Holocene steppe expansion accompanied by horse domestication and initial Turkic invasions into western Siberia. Then kind of a 500-year hiatus followed by another 500-year period, 3000 to 2500 BC, with a second major steppe expansion and further Turkic expansions into western and central Siberia. Then, after another 500-year hiatus, 2000 to 1500 BC, a third major steppe expansion associated both with further Turkic expansions in western Siberia, but also the first well-documented Mongolic expansions into southern Siberia, and the earliest expansion of Tungusic populations may also be dating to this time. And then, 1500 to 1000 BC, continued steppe expansion, increased Mongolic and probably Tungusic expansions into southern Siberia, resulting in the historical distributions that we started talking about. And of course, I'm particularly interested in this area of the Russian Far East, where I've done 3 field seasons of work. But there, as Ben was suggesting, the archaeological record may link at 2,000 years ago still to Nifk-like populations in this area, Nifk or Gilead populations, and only subsequent to that, within the last 2,000 years, that we're seeing Tungusic expansions into this area, isolating Nifk and Gilead and representing, this, as it says here, small Tungusic languages really becoming, thrusting into that area to a much greater extent only in the last 2,000 years. So conclusions, the Dene-Yenisian continuum may have been at its maximum distribution at around 4000 BC, 6,000 years ago. I love the fact that Ben continued to mention 6,000 years ago. I think we have a convergence of the minds on that number in a lot of ways, linguistically, archaeologically, and so on. With continued presence in the Siberian taiga and expansion into eastern Siberia during the Northern Archaic period. The cultural linguistic wedge began to develop during the late Neolithic period after about 4000 BC, associated with greater aridity and warming, steppe expansion, and horse and camel domestication, and reindeer domestication. 2, with the expansion of Turkic-speaking groups into western and central Siberia, the steppe Bronze Age after 2000 BC, following the Neoglacial period cooling, associated with dramatically warmer, drier conditions, and representing the first apparent expansion of Mongolic and Tungusic, as well as Turkic peoples in central and eastern Siberian region. Initial movements of Turkic and Mongolic peoples into central Siberia, creating the wedge, predate the Scythian expansion. That's the main point that I'm trying to make here, that they're pre-1000 BC, and so before the Scythian expansion, and later events associated with the formation of more politically complex societies, and that the initial population expansions of Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic peoples can be associated, at least tentatively, in this sort of arm-waving exercise, I guess, here, with paleoclimatic change and steppe expansion, although this is less clear for later periods with more complex factors operating. So that's basically, I guess I had a couple more. It's unclear exactly when the expansion of Evenki or Tungusic groups began. In central and eastern Siberia, they may have initially expanded from the Transbaikal region, where they may be the descendants of later Holocene populations, as indicated in physical traits associated with the later Holocene burial data from Andy Weber and others. I had to quote from Ed Vajda here. Ornaments found with the clothing of prehistoric inhabitants of the Transbaikal area strikingly similar to traditional Evenki designs. By this time, displaced hunter-gatherer populations of this region may have been proto-Yukaghir rather than Dene-Yenisian descendants, and definitive association of Yakut or Sakha expansion into eastern Siberia cannot confidently be linked to this earlier pre-1000 BC Turkic expansion, especially for the for the more northerly areas. Vajda notes that Yakut legends tell of the tribe's expulsion from the Transbaikal area nearly 1,000 years ago by the Buryats and other Mongol conquerors, so that this more northerly Siberian expansion of Turkic peoples may be linked more to expanding populations, competition, and warfare than to more recent climatic change and opportunism, although they may have been involved. And then finally, ideas of former matrilineality in myths of displaced forest groups may also hint of the relative recency of this displacement by patrilineal, herding peoples coming into the region. So that's it.